you've got a brand new country. Like, literally brand new. The ink on the Constitution is barely dry. George Washington just got inaugurated. People are hyped. Flags are waving. Everyone's feeling themselves. But out west, and by west, I mean Ohio, Indiana, that whole region, there's a full-blown war happening that most people today have never even heard of. And I'm not talking about a small skirmish. I'm talking coordinated attacks, devastating military disasters, and one of the most underrated Native American resistance movements in American history. This is the story of the Northwest Indian War. And trust me, by the end of this, you're going to be genuinely shocked this isn't talked about more. Let's get into it. Alright, so before we get to the actual fighting, we need to do a little context setting. Because nothing in history makes sense without context. It's 1783. The American Revolution just ended. Britain basically handed the United States a massive chunk of land called the Northwest Territory. We're talking present-day Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin. A massive region. Enormous. There's just one tiny problem. Britain didn't actually own that land. Like, at all. The native nations who had been living there for generations, the Shawnee, the Miami, the Delaware, the Potawatomi, the Ottawa, the Ojibwe, and several others, they were still there. They had their villages, their hunting grounds, their entire way of life. And nobody asked them anything. Not a single conversation. Not a negotiation in good faith. Nothing. The US government basically looked at a map, drew some lines, and went, "Yeah, that's ours now." And the native tribes looked at each other like, "Excuse me, what?" Now here's where it gets even more complicated. The US government, desperately broke after the revolution, by the way, completely in debt, needed to sell that land to settlers to raise money. So they started pushing settlers into the Northwest Territory almost immediately. Families packed up their wagons, crossed the Ohio River, and started building homesteads on land that was absolutely, 100%, already occupied. You can probably guess how that went. Now, this is where our two main characters come in. And I say main characters, because honestly, these guys deserve their own Netflix series. First, we've got Blue Jacket. Blue Jacket was a Shawnee war chief, and the man was magnetic, charismatic, strategic, absolutely fearless. He had a presence that commanded attention the moment he walked into a room, or, a war council around a fire. There's actually a legend, probably not true, but wild enough to mention, that he was originally a white man named Marmaduke Van Swearingen who was captured by the Shawnee as a teenager and chose to stay and fully adopt Shawnee identity. Historians are pretty skeptical of that story, but the fact that it exists tells you something about how larger than life this guy seemed even to people at the time. Blue Jacket's whole thing was unity. He believed, correctly, as it turns out, that the only way the native nations could push back against American expansion was if they stopped acting as separate tribes and started acting as one confederacy. One alliance. One front. Then we've got Little Turtle. Little Turtle was a Miami war chief, and where Blue Jacket was fire, Little Turtle was ice. Cold. Calculated. Brilliant military tactician. This guy thought in terms of terrain, timing, supply lines, psychological pressure. He was the kind of general who won battles before they started because he'd already thought 10 moves ahead. Together, Blue Jacket bringing the political energy and coalition building, Little Turtle bringing the military genius. These two guys were going to give the United States Army the absolute worst years of its early existence. And I mean that literally. What happens next is genuinely humiliating for the US military. So the US government, seeing the conflict escalating between settlers and native nations, decides to send in the military to, quote, pacify the region. Classic move. Never works out how they think it will. First up, Josiah Harmer, 1790. General Josiah Harmer leads about 1,400 men, a mix of regular soldiers and state militia, into the Northwest Territory to destroy native villages and break the resistance. On paper, this sounds like it should be straightforward. The U.S. has more men, more supplies, more institutional backing. But Little Turtle had a different plan. He watched Harmer's force move through the territory. He tracked them. He studied their patterns. And then, with precise, almost surgical timing, he set up ambushes that absolutely wrecked the American forces in not one but two separate engagements. The Battle of Heller's Corner and the Battle of the Wabash Tributaries. Harmer's force took heavy casualties and was forced to retreat. It was embarrassing. Like, historically embarrassing. The United States Army just got handed its lunch by a confederation of native warriors fighting on their home turf. Washington was furious. Congress was furious. The whole thing was a disaster. But instead of maybe reassessing their entire approach, they just tried again. So now they send in General Arthur St. Clair with an even bigger force, around 2,000 men. More troops. More guns. Surely this time it'll work, right? Wrong. On November 4, 1791, St. Clair's army camped along the Wabash River. It was cold. The men were exhausted. Discipline was loose. And Little Turtle, together with Blue Jacket, had been watching every single move they made. Before dawn, the native Confederacy launched a coordinated assault that hit the American camp from multiple directions simultaneously. The attack was so sudden, so overwhelming, so perfectly timed that St. Clair's force basically collapsed. The battle lasted about 3 hours. In those 3 hours, over 600 American soldiers were killed and hundreds more were wounded. St. Clair himself escaped on horseback, but his army was absolutely destroyed. Let's put that in perspective for a second. The Battle of St. Clair's defeat, or as the native people called it, the Battle of the Wabash, remains, to this day, the single greatest military defeat ever suffered by the United States Army at the hands of Native Americans. Proportionally, more U.S. soldiers died that day than at Custer's last stand, which everyone's heard of. But St. Clair's defeat? Most people have no clue it even happened. Washington reportedly threw one of the most epic presidential rages in American history when he heard the news. Like furniture throwing, ceiling hitting levels of anger. And honestly, fair. Okay, so at this point, the U.S. government is in a genuine crisis. They've lost 2 armies in 2 years. The Northwest Territory is still very much contested. Settlers are terrified. The whole project of westward expansion looks like it might actually fail. So Washington makes a new call. He reaches out to a general named Anthony Wayne. And Anthony Wayne was a character. His nickname was Mad Anthony. Not because he was unstable, well, maybe a little, but because of his absolutely aggressive, go hard or go home approach to everything. This was a man who believed that hesitation was the enemy of victory. He was bold to the point where people sometimes thought he'd lost his mind. But here's the thing. He was also incredibly disciplined and thorough in a way that Harmer and St. Clair were not. Wayne spent 2 years training his force before moving into the Northwest Territory. 2 years. He drilled his soldiers constantly. He worked on their discipline, their formations, their ability to fight in woodland terrain. He built a proper supply chain. He constructed forts as he moved forward, establishing bases so his army couldn't get cut off. He was not going to make the same mistakes. By 1794, Wayne was moving through Ohio with a force he called the Legion of the United States, about 3,500 soldiers, well-trained and well-supplied. Meanwhile, in the native Confederacy, cracks were starting to show. Little Turtle, the brilliant, calculating tactician, looked at Wayne's force and did something that was genuinely courageous in its own way. He told the other chiefs that this general was different. He said something along the lines of, "This is a general who never sleeps." He advised negotiation. He thought the Confederacy couldn't win this one. Blue Jacket disagreed. Blue Jacket believed they could fight, that they had to fight. And so Little Turtle stepped back from overall command. and Blue Jacket led the Confederacy into what would be the decisive battle of the war. August 20th, 1794, near present-day Toledo, Ohio. The battle site itself is kind of poetically named Fallen Timbers, because a massive tornado had torn through the area years earlier, leaving a landscape of downed trees, tangled roots, and broken trunks. It was chaotic terrain, the kind of place where an ambush could absolutely devastate an enemy. Blue Jacket chose this ground deliberately. He positioned about 1,500 warriors among the fallen trees, ready to do to Wayne exactly what Little Turtle had done to Harmer and St. Clair. But Anthony Wayne didn't walk into it. He sent cavalry around the flanks. He pushed his infantry forward in a way that didn't give the Confederacy time to set up their crossfire. And critically, the battle happened at a moment when many warriors had left the previous day expecting the attack to come then. So the Confederacy was actually at reduced strength when the real fight started. The battle lasted about 40 minutes. 40 minutes. After years of war, the Confederacy broke and retreated toward a British fort called Fort Miamis, where they fully expected to get support from their British allies. They knocked on the gate. They needed backup. And the British closed the gate on them, didn't let them in, didn't provide cover fire, just left them out there. This moment is hard to overstate. The British had been quietly supplying and encouraging the native Confederacy for years because they wanted the U.S. to fail in the Northwest Territory. They were playing both sides. But when it actually came down to it, they were not going to risk open war with the United States for the sake of their native allies. Blue Jacket's warriors, abandoned by the British, had nowhere to go. The battle was over. The war was, for all practical purposes, over. August 3rd, 1795. About a year after Fallen Timbers, the Treaty of Greenville was signed between Anthony Wayne and the leaders of the Native Confederacy, including, notably, both Blue Jacket and Little Turtle, along with chiefs from over a dozen other nations. The terms were brutal for the native side. They ceded most of present-day Ohio and a chunk of Indiana, the homelands that generations of people had lived on, hunted on, built their cultures around, gone. In exchange, the U.S. offered trade goods, annual payments, and promises of peace. The promises didn't last long. They never did. Little Turtle, after the treaty, actually became something of an advocate for peaceful coexistence. He visited Philadelphia. He met with John Adams. He genuinely tried to find a path where his people could survive in a world increasingly dominated by American expansion. But history wasn't kind to those efforts. Blue Jacket faded from the historical record after Greenville, living out his years in relative obscurity, a warrior whose moment had passed. And the Northwest Territory? It became the foundation for what would eventually be Ohio, 1803, Indiana, 1816, Illinois, 1818, and eventually several more states. The land was carved up, settled, developed, and transformed, and the nations who had fought so hard to hold on to it were pushed further and further to the margins. Okay, so we're near the end, and I want to take a second to zoom out, because I think this story matters for reasons beyond just the battles and the dates. The Northwest Indian War is one of the clearest examples of something that runs all the way through American history. This gap between the ideals written on paper and the reality of how the country actually expanded. The same generation that wrote "all men are created equal" and built a government based on the concept of rights and liberty was simultaneously pushing native nations off their land through military force. The contradiction was visible in real time. People at the time knew it was happening. Some of them even said it was wrong. But the machinery of expansion kept moving anyway. And the Native Confederacy that Blue Jacket and Little Turtle built? That was remarkable. Think about what they actually achieved. Multiple nations, different languages, different histories, different interests, united into a single military alliance that handed the U.S. Army 2 catastrophic defeats in a row. If the British had actually backed them up at Fort Miamis, if the Confederacy hadn't been stretched thin at Fallen Timbers, the entire trajectory of American westward expansion could have looked very different. These are the moments that don't make it into the main chapters of history books. But they should. Because this story isn't just about war. It's about strategy. It's about leadership. It's about what happens when people with nothing left to lose decide to fight back. It's about the price of broken promises. It's about two extraordinary leaders, one a passionate coalition builder, one a cold tactical genius, doing everything humanly possible to protect their people, and the heartbreaking reality of what happened anyway. So that's the Northwest Indian War, a decade of conflict that shaped the entire future of the American Midwest, fought by people whose names most of us were never taught in school. Blue Jacket, Little Turtle, two guys who should be household names. Now, real talk, if you made it this far, you actually just sat through a history lesson and didn't even notice because you were too locked in. And that's not me patting myself on the back. That's just what happens when history is actually told right, when you get the real people, the real stakes, the real drama that was already there. So here's my ask, and I'm not going to be subtle about it because honestly, subtlety is overrated. If this story hit different for you, if you learned something, if you felt something, if you're genuinely upset that you never heard about St. Clair's defeat before today, then smash that like button. Not because some algorithm told you to, but because it's literally the easiest way to tell me, hey, this was worth my time, and it helps more people find stories like this one. And subscribe, because we've got more of these coming. Stories that got buried, moments that got skipped over, people who deserved way more credit than history gave them. Every single week, you're already here. You've already invested the time. Hit subscribe and make it official. I'll catch you in the next one.